In 2024, the U.S. imported $422 billion worth of goods from Canada. That number is not just a statistic sitting in a trade report. It represents 60% of all crude oil America burns every single day. It represents the steel in American cars, the lumber in American homes. It represents the aluminum in every aircraft Boeing delivers to its clients. This is the foundation of what happened on August 1st, 2025. Trump pulled a trigger he had been loading for months very carefully. He raised tariffs on Canadian goods outside Kuzma from 25% to 35%. And then Washington sat back and waited for Canada to collapse outright. They were betting on one very simple assumption: Canada had nowhere else to go. If you study North American trade, that assumption looks almost reasonable on paper. Canada sends 76% of its total exports directly into the United States market. The dependency is not just economic, it is structural, historical, and deeply physical. Pipelines, highways, rail lines, they all point south toward one single customer. For decades, that customer was also Canada's closest ally and largest investor. In 2024 alone, U.S. foreign direct investment stock in Canada hit $459.6 billion. That relationship was not just trade, it was the backbone of two economies. Then Donald Trump decided to call that backbone a burden he was carrying. He claimed America was subsidizing Canada by over $200 billion every single year. Economists immediately corrected the record. The actual goods deficit was $70.6 billion. But Trump was not making an economic argument in 2025. He was making a power play. And on the surface, that power play had real teeth behind it. Undeniably, every day, $2.5 billion in goods crosses the US-Canada border without stopping. When tariffs rise, that number does not disappear. It gets more expensive for everyone. American consumers pay more for Canadian steel, lumber, auto parts, and energy products. But Canada absorbs the political hit while the US absorbs the inflationary cost quietly. That asymmetry is exactly what Trump was counting on when he signed that letter. He sent it directly to Mark Carney on his Truth Social platform, publicly, deliberately. The letter stated the 35% tariff would take effect on August 1st, 2025. Sharp. And then came the threat that froze the room when analysts first read it. Trump wrote, "If Canada retaliates, whatever number it chooses gets added to the 35%. That is not a negotiating position. That is a financial trap with one exit." It was designed to force Canada into silence, compliance, or a very expensive mistake. Washington assumed Carney would either fold quietly or retaliate and destroy his own economy. Those were the only two options the White House had modeled in their strategy. They forgot they were dealing with a man who spent decades modeling central bank scenarios. Mark Carney was not a career politician. Stumbling into his first economic crisis last year, he served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013 precisely. Then he became governor of the Bank of England, steering it through Brexit's financial chaos. He guided the UK economy through one of the most complex monetary periods in history. This is a man who spent his career reading leverage before anyone else in the room. When Trump sent that letter, Carney did not hold an emergency press conference immediately. He did not threaten dollar-for-dollar retaliation on American goods the next morning on television. He posted a carefully worded statement on X that said Canada was disappointed by this action. That single word, disappointed, was not weakness. It was a signal to those who knew. It told Washington exactly nothing about what Canada's next move would actually be in practice. And that calculated silence was the first brick in a counter-strategy built for months. If you subscribe to Money Signals, you already know silence and economics speaks the loudest. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a move like this one. Because what happened between that August 1st letter and Ottawa's actual response is the real story. The mainstream financial media covered the tariff number. Nobody covered what Carney did next. To understand Carney's counter, you have to understand why Trump raised the number to 35% exactly. The jump from 25% to 35% was not arbitrary. It was a negotiating ceiling signal. Trump was telling Carney, "This is how high I go before we talk seriously." But it also revealed something critical about Washington's position in the standoff. They needed a deal. 35 states in America list Canada as their single largest export destination by total value. Michigan alone exported nearly 30 billion worth of goods to Canada in 2024 alone. Texas refineries process Canadian crude that flows through pipelines the U.S. cannot easily replace. New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, their manufacturing sectors are woven into Canadian supply chains by design. This is the economic reality that Carney understood and that Trump's advisors apparently discounted completely. Canada's countermeasures in early 2025 had already demonstrated exactly how targeted that leverage could be. In the first phase of retaliation, Canada placed tariffs on $30 billion in American goods. Those tariffs were not random. They were surgical strikes on politically important American export sectors. Steel and aluminum alone represented $8.7 billion in potential tariff coverage across border states. American agriculture, beef, pork, fruits, vegetables faced $11.2 billion in combined tariff exposure from Canada. Electronics, another $12.1 billion in coverage, showed Canada was prepared to go beyond traditional categories. And Canada had already signaled it was considering expanding retaliation to $125 billion in U.S. goods. That number, 125 billion Canadian dollars, roughly 92 billion US dollars, is what froze Washington's counter initially, because $92 billion in targeted American exports is not a trade dispute. It is economic surgery. The provinces were already moving independently before the federal government even finalized its official response strategy. Manitoba had already pulled American liquor off government store shelves as a direct provincial countermeasure. Ontario was restricting American companies from government procurement contracts worth billions of dollars annually to them. These were not symbolic gestures. They hit American businesses where quarterly earnings reports live and breathe. And then Carney began doing something else, something the headlines almost entirely missed in reporting. He started traveling not to Washington, to Europe, to Asia, to every market Canada had not yet maximized. G7 partners, European Union trade ministers, Asian LG buyers. Carney visited them systematically, meeting after meeting. This was the diversification strategy activating in real time, while U.S. tariff talks were still ongoing. Canada's exports to the U.S. represented 76% of its total goods, an extreme and dangerous concentration. Carney had identified that concentration as Canada's single greatest strategic vulnerability in this trade standoff with Trump. So while the world watched the August 1st clock ticking, Carney was quietly rewiring Canada's trade architecture. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, Connect, completed in 2024, suddenly became more than an infrastructure project last year. It became a geopolitical lever that gave Canada the ability to ship Alberta crude to Asian markets. That single pipeline shifted the calculus of the entire negotiation in ways Washington had not fully modeled. Because if Canada could sell its oil east to Asia instead of south to American refineries, always, then the 60% crude oil dependency the U.S. had on Canada suddenly became a two-way vulnerability entirely. Trump's 35% tariff assumed Canada was locked in. The pipeline told a very different story after 2024, and Carney knew it. Every word he chose publicly after August 1st reflected that quiet confidence underneath. He was not bluffing when he said all options remained on the table. He had done the math. Washington had assumed the August 1st deadline would break Carney's resolve completely. Instead, it revealed something the White House had fundamentally miscalculated from the very beginning. A central banker does not panic when markets move against him unexpectedly and hard. A central banker repositions, hedges, and waits for the other side to blink first. That is exactly the playbook Mark Carney brought into this trade war from day one. While Trump was posting tariff letters on Truth Social, Carney was already 3 moves ahead quietly. The G7 summit in Canonis, Alberta in June 2025 was supposed to be routine diplomatic theater. It became something else entirely when Carney hosted Trump on Canadian soil for the first time. The optics mattered. Canada was not flying to Washington to beg for mercy this time. Trump came to Canada and Carney used every minute of that visit with surgical precision, deliberately. The two leaders agreed to a 30-day negotiating window to finalize a comprehensive trade and security deal. That window closed without a signed agreement. But Carney had gotten something more valuable than a deal. He had gotten time. And time in economic warfare is the most expensive asset anyone can hold. Every day of negotiations was a day Canadian businesses could prepare, pivot, and find alternative supply chains. Every day of talks was a day Canadian exporters could qualify more products under COSMA's protective umbrella. While Washington viewed the 30-day window as pressure on Canada, Ottawa viewed it as preparation time. This is the fundamental difference between a politician's approach to trade and a central banker's approach. Politicians negotiate to win headlines. Central bankers negotiate to shift the underlying structure of the problem. Carney was not trying to win a press conference. He was trying to win the decade, and the numbers on the ground began to reflect exactly that strategic patience in real economic terms. U.S. exports to Canada had already declined by 7.8% in early 2025 compared to 2024 levels. That decline was not accidental. It was the direct result of Canada's targeted countermeasure strategy working. Canadian consumers and government procurement offices had already begun consciously choosing non-American alternatives wherever economically possible. The Buy Canadian policy Carney formally announced was not just nationalist sentiment wrapped in a press release. It was a government-backed structural shift in purchasing behavior worth billions of dollars in annual contracts. Federal procurement, provincial spending, Crown Corporation contracts, all redirected toward Canadian suppliers over American ones deliberately. For American companies that had treated Canadian government contracts as guaranteed revenue, this was a shock. Suddenly, bids they had won for years were going to domestic Canadian competitors instead of them. And this was happening at exactly the moment American businesses were already absorbing Canadian retaliatory tariffs deeply. The U.S. steel and aluminum sector, which sells heavily into Canada, was watching margins compress quarter by quarter. American farmers who exported beef, pork, and grain to Canada were facing new cost barriers on their goods. The agricultural states, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, were feeling this in real economic terms, not just abstract trade data. And these are not blue states. These are Republican states whose senators have direct access to the White House. Political pressure from within Trump's own coalition was quietly building against the tariff escalation through summer 2025. But Trump had boxed himself in publicly. He had put the threat in writing on Truth Social. Backing down completely would look like weakness. Escalating further risked triggering a full Canadian retaliation immediately. So Washington did something revealing. It froze. No new executive orders, no escalation, no clear next step. The 35% tariff took effect on August 1st, but the expected chaos from Ottawa never materialized publicly. Carney's response was measured, calm, and strategically incomplete, which is exactly what made it so effective. He acknowledged the tariff. He expressed disappointment. He reaffirmed CUSMA, and then he said almost nothing else. That silence sent Washington's trade negotiators scrambling to figure out what Canada was actually planning behind closed doors. Because when your opponent stops being predictable, your entire strategy has to be rebuilt from the ground up. And rebuilding a trade strategy while 35 American states depend on Canadian market access is not simple work. Meanwhile, Carney was executing the second phase of something that had been months in the planning already. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion had changed Canada's energy equation in ways that were not fully appreciated in Washington. For decades, Alberta crude had one direction to travel, south into American refineries through existing pipeline infrastructure always. That captive geography was the foundation of American energy leverage over Canada in every previous trade dispute. If Canada gets difficult, the argument went, American refineries simply reduce Canadian crude intake and look elsewhere. But Trans Mountain's twin pipeline, completed in 2024, opened a Pacific Coast export terminal at Westridge in BC. Suddenly, Alberta crude could move west and load onto tankers bound for Asian markets and refineries abroad. In the first full year of expanded operations, Trans Mountain was moving 890,000 barrels per day westward. That is nearly 900,000 barrels per day that no longer needed American refinery access to find a buyer. When Carney signed the Memorandum of Understanding on a West Coast pipeline expansion in November 2025 with Alberta, Washington finally understood what had been happening quietly while trade talks consumed all the public attention and headlines. Canada was not just rerouting oil, it was rerouting dependency. And that changed everything in the negotiation, fundamentally. The LG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, was another piece of the same strategic puzzle being assembled. LG Canada, one of the largest energy infrastructure projects in Canadian history, was designed to ship liquefied natural gas, not to the United States, to Asia, to Japan, South Korea, and China's enormous and growing energy markets. When Asian buyers saw Canadian LNG arriving at competitive prices, they signed offtake agreements worth billions of dollars. Every one of those Asian agreements was $1 of energy revenue that no longer required American cooperation to earn. This is what Carney meant when he said Canada was strengthening trade partnerships throughout the world after the tariff letter. He was not making a diplomatic statement for domestic consumption. He was describing an active strategic repositioning already underway, and the financial markets were watching. Canadian dollar volatility, which had spiked in early 2025 on tariff fears, had begun to stabilize as investors realized Canada's diversification strategy was not just political theater, but real infrastructure execution. The Bank of Canada, operating independently from the Carney government, but reading the same economic signals, clearly had kept rates steady enough to cushion the tariff shock without triggering a recession in the domestic economy. Canada's economy contracted slightly in early 2025 under the initial tariff pressure. The pain was real and documented, but it did not spiral into the economic collapse that some Washington voices had privately predicted and hoped for. The resilience was not accidental. It was the product of countermeasures, diversification, strategic patience, and a government that moved fast. And perhaps most importantly, it was the product of a prime minister who understood that economic credibility is everything. When Carney said all options were on the table, markets believed him because his entire career said so. He had not built his reputation by bluffing. He had built it by acting when action was necessary. That credibility was now Canada's most powerful intangible asset in a trade war built on bluff and pressure. Washington had spent months assuming economic pain would force Canada into submission. Eventually, what it got instead was a country that used the pain as fuel for structural transformation. The trade war did not weaken Canada's economic architecture. It accelerated the rebuilding of it. And by the time August 2025 rolled into September, the evidence was impossible to ignore completely. Canada had already terminated most of its broad retaliatory tariffs by September 2025, strategically, but this was not surrender. It was a calculated de-escalation that served Canada's interests precisely. Removing those tariffs reduced inflationary pressure on Canadian consumers who had been absorbing higher costs. It gave Carney domestic political breathing room while keeping the most targeted tariffs firmly in place. Steel, aluminum, vehicles. Those sector-specific countermeasures stayed exactly where Carney had placed them from the start. The message to Washington was clear. Canada could adjust its posture without abandoning its position entirely. That kind of economic flexibility is not available to leaders who negotiate from panic or political desperation. It is only available to someone who built the strategy with enough layers to adjust in real time. And adjusting in real time is something Mark Carney had done his entire professional career before politics. When the Bank of England faced Brexit uncertainty, Carney did not issue rigid forward guidance and freeze there. He communicated conditional frameworks. If this happens, we do that. If conditions shift, the response shifts accordingly. He brought exactly that same framework into the Canada-US trade confrontation and applied it with discipline. The result was a negotiating position that Washington could never fully read or predict from one week to the next. Trade negotiators in DC were dealing with a counterpart who had literally written academic papers on monetary strategy. This was not a prime minister winging it. This was a systematically trained economist executing a deliberate playbook. And the playbook had one core principle that drove every decision from March 2025 through August and beyond. Never give your counterpart certainty about your next move when uncertainty is your most valuable bargaining chip available. Carney applied that principle in every public statement, every negotiating session, every diplomatic trip abroad he made. When asked directly if Canada would impose the full $92 billion in retaliatory tariffs, Carney deflected masterfully. He said all options remained available. He said Canada would defend its workers. He said nothing specific. That deliberate vagueness cost Washington more than any specific tariff threat Canada could have publicly announced itself, because $92 billion in potential tariffs hanging over American exporters changed their business planning immediately and completely. American companies that sold into Canada began accelerating their KSMA compliance certifications to protect their market access there. American trade associations started lobbying the White House harder, not Canada, the White House, to resolve this. The political pressure was now flowing in exactly the direction Carney's strategy had been designed to push it. From Canadian retaliatory threats flowing back into American domestic politics through the business community's direct lobbying channels. This is the sophistication that the mainstream financial coverage missed entirely when reporting on this trade confrontation. They reported the tariff numbers. They reported the diplomatic meetings. They missed the underlying pressure architecture completely. By late 2025, the architecture was producing visible results that showed up in actual trade and policy data. The Supreme Court of the United States issued a ruling in February 2026 on the IEA Tariff Authority. That ruling ended the specific tariffs Trump had imposed on Canada under emergency powers claimed for fentanyl justification. The legal mechanism Trump had used, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was successfully challenged in court. Canada had been challenging those tariffs at the World Trade Organization simultaneously on multiple procedural and substantive grounds. The combination of domestic American legal pressure and international trade law pressure created a pincer the White House felt. And through all of it, Carney never stopped negotiating. He kept the door open while keeping his leverage active. The G7 meetings, the bilateral calls, the diplomatic visits to European capitals, all of it served dual purposes. Every meeting with a European trade minister was also a signal to Washington that Canada had real alternatives available. Every LNG offtake agreement signed with an Asian buyer was a data point in Canada's negotiating file with America. This is called strategic optionality in financial terms, and Carney understood it better than anyone in the room. When you have options, your counterpart's leverage over you decreases proportionally with every option you visibly exercise publicly. Canada exercised those options loudly enough for markets to price them in, but quietly enough to keep Washington guessing. The Canadian dollar, which had weakened under initial tariff pressure in early 2025, began recovering ground by late year. Investor confidence in Canadian energy assets, pipelines, LG terminals, resource companies remained fundamentally strong throughout the confrontation. Because sophisticated investors could read what journalists were not writing, Canada's long-term position was stronger than it looked. The short-term pain of a 35% tariff on non-COSMA goods was real, but geographically limited in actual scope. Remember, COSMA-compliant goods remained exempt throughout, and approximately 38% of Canadian exports already qualified for KSMA protection. The 35% tariff hit hard in specific sectors: lumber, steel outside COSMA, certain agricultural goods, processed products. But the COSMA framework acted as a floor that prevented the tariff war from becoming a total trade collapse. Carney had publicly reaffirmed CUSMA's importance immediately after the August 1st announcement, and that signal mattered enormously to markets. It told investors that the rules-based trading framework between the two countries had not been fundamentally abandoned by either side, and it gave Canadian businesses a clear compliance pathway. Certify under CUSMA, protect your American market access today. Thousands of Canadian companies accelerated their CUSMA compliance processes precisely because Carney had made that signal so clearly. This is how a central banker fights a trade war differently from how a conventional politician fights one always. A politician responds to the headline. A central banker responds to the underlying incentive structure driving all behavior. Carney changed the incentive structure for Canadian businesses, for American lobbying groups, for Asian energy buyers, for investors. And when you change incentive structures at that scale, the headline eventually catches up to the reality below it. By mid-2026, the CUSMA joint review process, scheduled for July 2026, became the new focal point for both sides. That review gave both countries a structured, rules-based framework to address the trade grievances that tariffs had weaponized. It was the off-ramp Washington needed, and the framework Canada had been preserving throughout the entire confrontation carefully. The bilateral trade relationship, $422 billion in imports, $350 billion in exports, $2.5 billion crossing daily, was too large, too integrated, and too structurally interdependent to be permanently dismantled by executive orders and truth social letters. Both economies knew it. Both sides needed the off-ramp. Carney had made sure Canada arrived there with leverage intact. That is the story the numbers tell when you follow them past the headlines and into the actual data. Trump fired a 35% tariff and expected collapse. Carney responded with silence, strategy, and structural repositioning over months. Washington froze, not because Carney threatened them loudest, but because he gave them the least certainty about Canada's next move. In economic warfare, uncertainty imposed on your opponent is worth more than any single tariff you can announce publicly. Mark Carney understood that principle in his bones. He had spent 30 years applying it in the world's biggest financial rooms. And on August 1st, 2025, when the clock hit midnight and the 35% tariff activated against Canada's exports, the counter that froze Washington was not a press release. It was a strategy already 3 moves deep in execution. That is what $422 billion in bilateral trade looks like when one side finally decides to play the long game. If this video gave you a clearer picture of how real economic power actually moves behind the headlines, hit subscribe on Money Signals right now, because this is exactly the level of analysis we bring every single time. Drop a comment below. Do you think Carney played this better than Washington expected, or did Trump still win here? Your perspective matters on this channel, and we read every single comment that comes through on Money Signals.